My brother made fun of me for not having a career while hiding his debts. So I revealed the truth during his job interview party. I am one of those people who tend to keep quiet about their problems. Endure. And move on. But I can't do it anymore. I'm at my limit. To give you context, I'm 27 years old and live in a small town in the Midwest of the United States. I'm the youngest of two brothers. And if I had to describe our relationship in one word, it would be complicated. Well, actually, today I would describe it as an absolute disaster. My older brother, let's call him Mark, was always the golden child of the family. For as long as I can remember, he was the one who did everything right: good grades, sports, friends, everything I never had. Don't get me wrong. It's not that I was terrible. I was simply never special. Mark was the kind of guy who would walk into a room and everyone wanted to talk to him. I was the one in the corner holding someone's coat. It wasn't always like this. As kids, we were inseparable. We built forts in the backyard, watched cartoons until late, and shared secrets like any pair of siblings. But things changed when we grew up. In high school, he became popular while I was just his brother. I didn't have my own identity. And although that hurt, I learned to accept it. After all, what could I do? I wasn't as athletic or charismatic as him. Everything got worse after Mark graduated and moved to Chicago. For my family, Mark was living proof that we had done things right. He got a marketing job at a big company and settled into a nice apartment downtown. Every time he talked to my parents, it was to boast about how well he was doing. At family gatherings, everyone listened to his success stories with bright eyes while I tried to go unnoticed. However, there was something no one else knew. Mark wasn't as successful as he seemed. During one of his visits, he left some papers at my parents' house. And out of pure curiosity and a bit of boredom, I reviewed them. It turns out he was in a huge financial mess: credit cards maxed out, personal loans, even late payments on his apartment. I didn't mention it to anyone. What was the point? I didn't want to be the bitter brother trying to tear down the family favorite. But things started to get out of control a couple of years ago. After losing my job at a local store, I had to move back in with my parents. It was a hard blow to my self-esteem. But I had no other choice. My parents didn't seem bothered. In fact, they were happy to have me close by. But Mark? Oh. Mark had opinions. And he made sure I heard them. Every time he came to visit, he would make sarcastic comments about my lack of ambition. He would say things like, "You're still here? I thought you would have found something by now," or, "How is it living without paying rent? It must be nice not having responsibilities." At first, I tried to ignore him. But his comments became increasingly cruel. The worst came during the last Christmas. We were all gathered in the living room opening presents. Everything was going well until Mark decided it was the perfect time to make me look ridiculous. He looked at me and, with a mocking smile, said, "Well, at least you have a talent for wrapping gifts. Maybe that could be your career." Everyone laughed. Even my parents. I tried to smile. But inside I wanted to disappear. That night, after everyone went to bed, I stayed in the living room looking at the Christmas tree and feeling smaller than ever. But here's the irony: while Mark was making me feel like a failure, I knew his secret. I knew that behind his facade of a successful man, he was on the verge of financial collapse. And for some reason, that thought gave me some comfort. Not because I wanted to see him fail, but because it reminded me that he wasn't as perfect as everyone thought. However, everything changed a few weeks ago. My parents decided to throw a big party at home to celebrate that Mark had gotten a promotion at his job. The idea was to invite family and close friends to congratulate him. When I found out, something inside me clicked. I couldn't keep letting Mark humiliate me. Not when I knew the truth about him. I decided it was time to do something about it. When my parents announced the party to celebrate Mark, I thought it was a joke. Not that I was surprised that they wanted to highlight the achievements of their older son. It had happened before: graduations, new jobs, even when he got his first used car. My parents organized a small gathering. So, of course, now that Mark had gotten a promotion at his office in Chicago, a party was the least we could expect. But what bothered me was not the party itself, but Mark's attitude. I overheard him talking to my mother on the phone, and he was enjoying all the attention way too much. Make it elegant, Mom. I want it to be something memorable. Maybe you can even hire a caterer. Something different this time, he said, as if he were a celebrity organizing his personal gala. As soon as he hung up, he looked at me with that condescending smile he had perfected over the years. I guess you'll be serving the appetizers, he blurted out mockingly. It was then that I decided enough was enough. I wasn't going to be his emotional punching bag at that party. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had a slight advantage over him. And although I knew what I was planning wasn't entirely right, I convinced myself that he deserved it. After all, he had spent years trampling on me, making me feel less, even when he knew that his own success was a facade. I started drawing up a plan. I wanted it to be perfect. A clean blow that would reveal Mark's true face to everyone. But at the same time, I didn't want my parents to get caught in the crossfire. After all, they weren't to blame for how Mark treated me. So, I decided that the best way to expose him was by letting him unmask himself first. I gathered evidence. I knew he had left more financial documents at home during his previous visits, and I made sure to gather each piece of information was a brick in the wall I would build to bring him down. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. Mark had always been good at manipulating the narrative. And if I simply accused him in front of everyone, he would find a way to get away with it. The perfect opportunity came a week before the party. My parents were busy with the preparations, so I offered to help. That's when I casually mentioned that Mark could give a small speech during dinner. Something to thank everyone for coming and sharing his success. My parents loved the idea, and I knew I had my moment. If I could get Mark to talk about how wonderful his job was and how well he was doing, it would only be a matter of time before someone asked questions, and I would be ready with the answers. The week leading up to the party was a mix of excitement and nerves. Part of me felt guilty. After all, he was my brother. But every time I remembered his taunts, his way of belittling me in front of others, the guilt disappeared. I told myself that this wasn't revenge, but justice. If he constantly wanted to humiliate me, then it was only fair for the rest of the world to see who he really was. When the day of the party arrived, the house was full of people. My parents had really exceeded all expectations: decorative lights, a catering service that seemed too expensive for our small community, and a central table that could have come straight out of a magazine. Mark, as expected, was in the center of everything. He walked among the guests, laughing and telling them stories about his successful job in Chicago. Every time he passed by me, he made some sarcastic comment. Like, "Are you taking notes on what success looks like?" Or, "Maybe I should socialize a bit. You never know. Someone might offer you a job." I stayed in the background, watching and waiting for my moment. I knew Mark couldn't resist speaking in public, so I wasn't surprised when, just before dinner, my mother announced that her oldest son wanted to say a few words. Everyone gathered around the main table, and Mark stood up, holding a glass of wine in his hand, smiling as if he were receiving an award. "Well, first, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began. "It means a lot to me to see so many familiar faces celebrating this special moment. The promotion I got at the office wasn't easy, but with a lot of hard work and dedication, I managed to stand out among my colleagues. Now, I lead one of the most important teams in the company, and I'm excited about what the future holds." People applauded, and Mark seemed to absorb every second of the attention. "It's a reminder," he continued, "that with effort and ambition, you can achieve anything. And well, it's always important to have your family supporting you along the way. Thank you, Mom and Dad. For always believing in me. And to you, little brother. I hope you find your way someday too. That last sentence was like a spark in a powder keg. While everyone was applauding again, I realized it was time. But instead of saying something directly, I decided to let Mark dig his own grave. When the applause died down, I raised my glass and, with a smile, said, "Wow, Mark. It sounds incredible. Why don't you tell us a bit more about how you managed all of that with your budget? It must have been difficult to balance finances while working so hard." Mark looked at me, confused at first. But then I saw his expression change to a mix of anger and nervousness. "Well, you know, it's not easy at first. But you learn to manage," he replied, trying to sound casual. "Really?" I asked, leaning in. Because I've seen some things that seem quite complicated to manage. But, of course, you can surely explain it better than I can. The murmur in the room was palpable. The guests were looking at each other, clearly interested in what was happening. After launching my little comment, the entire room fell silent. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see how Mark was going to respond. I could feel the tension in the air. And although I tried to maintain a neutral expression, inside I was enjoying every second. Mark let out a nervous chuckle and said, "Well, yes. Like in any career, there are financial challenges. But I've been smart in managing them." His voice was firm, but there was a slight tremor in his tone. Something that only someone who knew him well could notice. "Smart, you say?" I replied, leaning in. Some guests exchanged glances, and I saw my mother frown, confused. Mark gave me a murderous look, and it was then that I realized I had hit the bullseye. He was furious but also scared. And when Mark feels cornered, he always resorts to attack. "What the hell are you implying?" he said through gritted teeth. "If you have something to say it at once." "Sure, Mark. Since you insist." I pulled out a folder that I had hidden under the table. It was a compilation of all the documents I had found in the last few months, bank statements, collection letters, and even a foreclosure notice for his car. Everything was there, perfectly organized and ready to be revealed. "Does this look familiar?" I said as I pulled out one of the papers and held it up. "Because according to this, you're behind on your credit card payments. Or what about this letter from your landlord saying that you're 3 months late on rent? And let's not forget this collection notice for your student loan." The murmur in the room stopped. Everyone was staring at him, waiting for his reaction. I could feel the disbelief of the guests, the confusion of my parents, and, best of all, the absolute panic in Mark's eyes. "This is nonsense," he said, trying to sound confident. "I don't know where you got those things. But you're clearly making things up to get attention. Because you can't stand to see me succeed." "Make up?" I repeated, laughing sarcastically. "Mark, please. These documents have your name, your address, and in some cases, even your signature. Do you want me to pass this around the room so everyone can see it? Because I'm sure they'd be delighted to help you explain how you managed to achieve so much success while being buried in debt." Mark was red with anger now. He abruptly stood up from his seat and pointed his finger at me. "You're a damn liar. This has nothing to do with the party. You're just trying to ruin my moment because you can't stand that I'm better than you." That was enough for my mother. "Mark. Enough," she shouted, standing up. The entire room froze. "What is your brother talking about? What are those papers?" "It's nothing, Mom," Mark replied, almost pleading. "He's just making things up to get attention." "I don't think so," my father said with a serious tone that he rarely used. He stood up from his seat and took one of the documents from the folder I was holding. He read it carefully, and I saw his face change from disbelief to a mixture of disappointment and anger. "Is this true, Mark?" he asked, holding the paper in the air. "Are you in debt? And you didn't tell us?" Mark tried to defend himself. Dad. It's not that simple. I have everything under control. It's just a phase. I'm working to get out of this. Working to get out of this? I interrupted, unable to contain myself. Is that what you call ignoring collection letters and continuing to spend money as if you were a millionaire? Because according to this, your savings account is practically empty. And you're using your credit cards to cover expenses. The impact of my words was evident. The guests were whispering. My parents were stunned. And Mark looked like he was about to explode. But I wasn't done yet. And you know what's the worst of all? Mark? I continued. It's not that you're in financial trouble. We all face difficulties at some point. The worst is that you dare to come here and make fun of me for living with our parents while you can't stay afloat without your facade of success. You've spent years belittling me, making me feel like a failure when, in reality, you're the one who's faking it. The room fell into complete silence. I could hear my own heart beating loudly as I looked at Mark, waiting for his response. But for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. He was completely defeated. My mother was the first to speak. Mark, is all this true? Have you been hiding this while pretending everything was okay? He didn't answer. Lowered his gaze, unable to face his own mistakes. It was then that I knew I had won. After years of being the shadow, the one who was always one step behind, I had finally had my moment. But this was just the beginning. I knew that the real reaction would come later when everyone processed what had just happened. And although I felt relieved, I was also nervous about what would come next. After everything was exposed, the room remained silent for what seemed like ages. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if everyone was frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. My parents were in shock, unable to believe that their golden child, the supposed example of success, had been living a lie all this time. The guests who minutes before were celebrating and laughing were now murmuring among themselves, exchanging looks of astonishment and disbelief. Mark was still sitting with his head down, unable to look at anyone. He had lost all the air of superiority that usually surrounded him. For the first time in years, he seemed small, almost defenseless. And although I should have felt victorious, there was something in his expression that made me feel guilty. Not guilty exactly. Maybe compassion. My father broke the silence, speaking with a firmness he rarely used. Mark, he said in a low but disappointed voice, I need you to explain this to us now. Mark raised his head slowly, his face completely red. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the necessary strength to speak, and finally said, I didn't want to worry you. His voice was weak, almost inaudible. I thought I could handle it. That I would find a way out of this without anyone finding out. Handle it, my mother replied, her eyes filled with tears. You've been lying to us for years. You made us believe that everything was fine while you sank deeper and deeper into your problems. How could you? Mark? Mark tried to justify himself. I didn't want you to think I had failed. You always expected so much from me. And I couldn't bear to disappoint you. That last sentence fell like a bomb. My parents looked at each other and then at me, as if they were realizing something for the first time. All their attention had been on Mark for so many years, pushing him, praising him, while leaving me aside. And now, that favoritism had exploded in their faces. Before anyone could respond, one of the guests spoke. It was my parents' old neighbor, Mr. Johnson, who had always been a bit nosy. Well, he said with his characteristic sarcastic smile, it seems like the golden boy isn't so perfect after all. Who would have imagined? That comment broke the tension. Some guests started to laugh nervously, while others tried to pretend they hadn't heard anything. But the damage was done. The image of perfection that Mark had built for years had crumbled in front of everyone. However, Mark wasn't ready to accept defeat without a fight. He stood up abruptly, his face still red, and pointed a trembling finger at me. This is all your fault, he shouted. You've always been jealous of me. Always looking for ways to make me look bad. You're a loser who lives with mom and dad and can't stand that I've done something with my life. For a moment, I felt the ground move beneath my feet. His attack took me by surprise. And for a second, I wondered if I had made a mistake in exposing him. But then I remembered all the years of sarcastic comments, of taunts, of making me feel like I was less. I straightened up and looked him directly in the eyes. Really? Mark? I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. Is that the best you've got? Blaming me for your own mistakes. Maybe you should stop worrying so much about what I do with my life and start fixing the mess you've made with yours. The room fell silent again. Mark looked like he was about to explode. But before he could say anything, my mother intervened. Enough. You two, she exclaimed. It's enough for one night. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. Then she looked at Mark, her eyes still filled with tears. We need to talk about this. But not now. This isn't something we can resolve at a party. My father nodded, although his expression remained severe. Mark, he said, we'll sit down and talk tomorrow morning. And you better have clear answers because this won't end like this. Mark didn't answer. He simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving the guests in an uncomfortable silence. I could hear the growing murmur as everyone tried to process what had just happened. After Mark left, my mother tried to salvage what was left of the evening. Thank you all for coming, she said, trying to sound cheerful. We regret the incident, but we appreciate you being here to celebrate with us. The guests slowly began to disperse, some still murmuring among themselves. I stayed in a corner, watching as the room emptied, feeling exhausted but at the same time strangely at peace. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had stood up for myself, that I had put an end to years of humiliation. The next morning, the house was quieter than usual. The tension was palpable. My mother was in the kitchen, moving like a ghost while making coffee. And my father was sitting in his usual chair, staring at the table, lost in his thoughts. I was in my room, trying to find the courage to face what I knew would be an explosive confrontation. Finally, I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. Mark had left his room. His door slammed shut, and soon I heard him walk down the stairs with a determined pace. I knew he was upset, but I also knew he had no more escape routes. This time there was no way to manipulate the situation or hide behind his charisma. When I went down, Mark was already sitting across from our parents. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and messy hair. It was clear he hadn't slept well. I approached slowly, taking a seat in the corner of the sofa, watching as my parents exchanged glances before my father spoke. Mark, he began with a stern but controlled tone. I think it's time you told us the truth. No excuses. No beating around the bush. We want to know exactly what's going on. Mark sighed, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. Okay, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I'll tell you everything. For the next hour, Mark detailed the mountain of problems he was in. He admitted that he had been living beyond his means from the moment he moved to Chicago. He bought an expensive car he couldn't afford, rented a luxurious apartment, and used credit cards to pay for everything from furniture to dinners at fancy restaurants. He wanted to maintain the image of success, not only for our family but also for his friends and colleagues. Everything got out of control, he said, with tears in his eyes. It started with small things, but then the debts grew, and I just couldn't keep up. I tried to cover it with more loans, but that only made things worse. Now, I'm trapped. My parents were visibly shocked. My mother had tears running down her face, while my father remained expressionless, although his hands clenched on the table revealed his anger. When Mark finished, there was a long silence in the room. And you thought the best solution was to lie to us? My father finally asked, with a cold tone he rarely used. To make us believe everything was fine while you buried yourself in debt. I didn't want to disappoint you, Mark replied, his voice breaking. You always expected so much from me. I was always the one who had to do everything right. I couldn't bear for you to see that I had failed. And does that justify the way you treated your brother? My mother interjected, surprising everyone, including Mark. How could you make fun of him? Humiliate him when you were in a much worse situation? How did you think that was okay? Mark opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. It was evident that he had no answer for that. For years, he had used his supposed success as a weapon to keep me in an inferior place. And now that that weapon had broken, he was completely disarmed. He has no excuse, I said finally, breaking the silence. But I'm not here to see him grovel. What he did was wrong, and I'm not going to forgive him easily. But I think that now he needs help more than he needs our scorn. My words surprised everyone, including myself. I had spent years accumulating resentment towards Mark. But at that moment, something in me changed. Maybe it was because seeing him so defeated made me realize that he wasn't as invulnerable as I had always thought. He was human, with flaws like everyone else. And although his actions weren't justified, I wasn't willing to let him sink completely either. My father sighed deeply, nodding slowly. Okay, Mark, he said. We're going to help you. But with conditions. No more lies. No more appearances. We're going to make a plan to get out of this. But it will be your responsibility to follow it. Mark nodded, with tears running down his face. Thank you, he said in a low voice. I don't deserve your help. But I promise I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. In the following weeks, things started to change. Mark began working on a budget with the help of my father, while my mother helped him find ways to reduce his expenses. He sold his expensive car, moved to a more affordable apartment, and began looking for ways to earn additional income. It wasn't easy, but little by little, he began to regain control of his life. Our relationship also began to improve. Although it wasn't perfect, Mark finally began to treat me with respect. He even apologized for all the years of cruel comments, admitting that he had projected his own insecurities onto me. It wasn't an instant change, but it was a start.